Well, welcome everyone. I hope you all have taken advantage of the cookies and coffee next door as we continue our day together. Again, I'm Wendy Kapoor, I'm the director of Thrive, and really excited about this this workshop because I'm going to be able to learn a lot as well. And so we are going to be starting with Dennis Canty, who's the Northwest Regional Director for the American Farmland Trust, and he's going to start out with a real overview of what is happening in terms of agricultural land preservation tools across the U.S. And secondly, we'll be moving to Kathleen Daniels from the Department of Land Conservation and Development that can tell us more specifically about what tools are available to us in Oregon and some new legislation as well. So what I'm going to do is ask the presenters to speak, and then we will reserve time at the end for questions unless you have any really specific clarifying questions in the interim. So without any further ado, I will introduce Dennis.
Thank you very much. So I'm Dennis Canty. I'm the Regional Director for the American Farmland Trust. The American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit organization focused on farmland preservation. We've been in business since 1980. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we have regional offices spread around the country, including one in Seattle, where our region covers Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And just to give you a sense of what we're up to as an organization, we've done a lot of work on to try to establish farmland protection programs at the state and local level around the country, and have been involved in most of the creation and most of the state programs that have come into being over the last few years. We'll touch on some of those programs here in the presentation. We also work on land use policy related to farmland, and that keeps us pretty busy in Washington State. We'll also talk a little bit about sort of comparing Washington and Oregon here today. And then finally, we work on local food initiatives, and we're in production right now with the Western Washington Food Shed study that compares what we eat and what we grow in Western Washington, and talks about how to create a more local food system. And you fortunate people are going to hear me twice this afternoon. I actually am going to be doing a keynote speech later on this afternoon. It really focuses more on the food-farm connection and how important a better food system is for long-term protection of farmland. So I won't talk about that much in the afternoon here. What I do want to do today is just give you a quick once-over lightly on basic tools for farmland protection. And I'll reference Oregon as I can. Let's start off with some very basic questions that you might pose in the communities that you're from about whether your community is doing everything it can to protect agricultural land. And in Oregon as well as in Washington, a tremendous amount of authority for protection of agricultural land is delegated to local governments. That's not quite as true here in Oregon because of your state land use planning. But there's still a tremendous amount of discretion that local governments have on farmland protection. And what we're finding is that local governments that take the full range of their responsibilities seriously have much better track records in terms of protection of farmland. And so there are basic questions that I would tend to pose on planning for agriculture. Land use and environmental regulations compatible with farm use, regulations flexible enough to allow changes in farm uses and products. I've had some really interesting discussions here today about whether this structure of land use planning here allows sufficient flexibility for farmers to actually respond to changes in marketplace conditions. Is the community taking positive action regarding the retirement of development rights on farms? Another kind of key issue. Community offering sufficient property tax relief and providing economic development and marketing assistance. And as I say, the most successful communities around the Northwest are really doing all of these things at this point. And so it's kind of a daunting task if you're a local government official to try to do all this. So I'm going to touch very briefly on these four categories of tools for preservation of farmland and talk a little bit about what's happening here. So in the planning and zoning tools, we have comprehensive planning, zoning, and subdivision ordinances, right to farm laws, ag use districts, and mitigation for farmland loss. And I think you're probably all familiar with the basic underpinnings of comprehensive planning here, where there's the plan is used to describe development policy, how farmland gets protected, where we're going to develop property, et cetera. Provides the basis for public decisions on spending for the next 10 to 20 years, and that's kind of a key role for comprehensive planning as it focuses investments in all kinds of infrastructure. So it guides decisions about development applications, infrastructure development, and zoning, and often includes maps that are crucial to the agricultural sector, indicating where future needs of agriculture and development may either coexist or collide. And oftentimes, of course, we see these collisions in practice fought out in zoning. Let's see, there was a presentation earlier today that showed a zoning map up on the wall, and it had a bunch of different zoning categories, including your EFU category. Zoning, of course, establishes allowable uses, densities, and other restrictions on development. So exclusive farm use is theoretically about exclusive farm use. Of course, we know that there are a few other things that have snuck into that code over the years. Subdivision ordinances really focus more on the development pattern and what happens with residential development in those areas, and specifically, how big the lots are and whether clustering is allowed and all these sorts of things. And together, these are the most critical tools of protecting farmland. And some people might look at that statement, they say, well, isn't that, conservation easements or protection of development rights? And what we find is that unless the zoning structure is there to start with, unless it really provides the foundation for protection, there's no way that you can address major shortcomings in zoning by buying rights. I mean, for one, what we see is that zoning really determines the uses of the property that are possible. And if you commingle residential and farm uses on the same rural real estate, the residential uses drive up the values to the point where there's absolutely no way you can buy yourself out of trouble. And so you folks are remarkably fortunate to have a very good underlying zoning structure here in Oregon State. We don't have it in Washington, and we pay for it all the time, because what we see very commonly is that we have a mix of residential and agricultural values on virtually our entire rural landscape. And the agricultural value drives the land value to the point where farmers have a difficulty purchasing property, tax bills are really, really high. And while we try after the fact to apply the acquisition strategies, the purchase and transfer of development rights, it's pretty much of a lost cause unless we're able to restore balance in the zoning decisions. And so we started a campaign this year to protect another 100,000 acres of farmland in the Puget Sound region in western Washington. And it starts with trying to get more sensible land use planning up there. It's not a battle that you have to fight for the most part, because the people who were around here in the late 70s had the foresight to do it right in the first place. But it's really kind of a critical part of that. Now, there are other aspects of the regulatory side that are quite important too. Right to farm laws, and basically this anticipates that there may be a mix of farm and residential uses in the rural landscape, and that in order for farmers to be able to continue their day-to-day activities, they need some insulation from nuisance suits and that deal with noise or air quality or water quality issues, noise and odors, basically. And so Oregon has a right to farm statute at the state level. Most of the state agencies do. A lot of local governments do as well. Agricultural use districts, so this is a sort of refinement on zoning, and it allows a kind of an overlay on the basic zoning code. to establish circumstances very specific in the district. I don't know how widely this is used here in Oregon. It's a pretty widely applied tool in Washington State. Let's see, where am I? Did I miss something? No, there we have. Farmland mitigation policies. So I just want to touch on these. These are not terribly widely used. There may be a dozen in use around the country. Davis, California was one of the pioneers here. There are another handful of communities in California. The state of Vermont also has an ag mitigation policy. And the way this works is that there's an expectation that over time, through other development activities, farmland may be lost. And this actually creates a strategy for compensating for that loss, generally on a mitigation ratio basis. So for every acre lost to a non-farm use, you would have to do something. Either, oftentimes it's simply protecting another acre of farmland. Sometimes it's actually bringing land back into production. And I understand that this has been batted about a little bit here in Southern Oregon, and I'm actually working on a set of policies right now for a county up in Washington State, Whatcom County, right up on the Canadian border. And it's kind of an interesting set of policies. It all is founded in a goal established by their county council to protect 100,000 acres of farmland permanently for agricultural production. And the really great thing about this policy is that suddenly every acre of farmland is valuable, and it therefore requires that if farmland is lost over time, there has to be some mechanism for compensating for it. And it's proven to be really transformative up in Whatcom County. You know, suddenly every one of those development decisions that used to get rubber stamped by the county council now gets looked at much more intensively. And so it's been a great policy. It's something that we'd love to see elsewhere. And so it's not, we don't really construct it as no net loss, but as a numeric goal for the preservation of farmland. It might be something that you want to consider in your communities. It's been pretty effective, I would say. Of course, no farmland protection program would be complete without some mechanism for permanently protecting the land base. And I've had some really interesting conversations down here in Oregon over the last couple of weeks about whether your agricultural zoning provides permanence or sufficient permanence and protection. And I think a lot of people recognize that zoning can be overturned by the next political regime. And while you now have had the same underlying zoning policies in place for 30 plus years, it doesn't mean that you can rely on them forever. And so we've had some really interesting conversations here about how to layer on purchase of development rights on your zoning programs. And there are a lot of interesting constraints here in Oregon, mostly to do with this sort of differential in value, the with and without easement scenarios, and the fact that those are so similar in value that it's very difficult to pay much for an easement here in Oregon. Despite the fact that we all recognize that there's something important about the permanence provided by removing development rights, it's really not reflected in the appraisal process. And so, and that's a fairly significant barrier to kind of getting this next level of protection. You know, this is typically executed through conservation easements. I don't know how many of you actually attended the session on conservation easements in the last period, but if so, this will be a little redundant. These, of course, are voluntary legal agreements between landowners and conservation organizations or government agencies. I don't know in this case how many government agencies are actually acquiring easements down here. Permanently limit a property's use. So this is the permanent tool. They typically remove development rights to restrict non-farm development and subdivision. So at the same time, they protect the agricultural value and productivity of the land. So the farmer continues to own the underlying land. They're continuing to operate the agricultural use on that property. When properly written, they allow a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of the future of agricultural use. If you have questions as I go through this, please.
So what would you describe us what would an easement be utilized for? Like,
So typically, the easement is used to remove the development right from the property and to establish that it's intended for permanent agricultural use.
okay.
And the conservation organization or the government agency would actually buy that. And that would get valued generally through this appraisal process that looks at the value of the property with and without the easement, and that establishes the easement value.
So what kind of money would be paid towards that? Like maybe, you know, around here, irrigated ground's like $10,000 an acre.
Yeah.
And if you have it annexed into the city, then you're selling a building lot for, which is about a quarter of an acre, for about 250,000
Right.
or 200,000, and you know, so that's like value that 800 to $1 million.
Yeah. So 8 or 10.
So what kind of percentage would they pay you to not develop that?
Well, so typically the way it would be evaluated is if they were going to actually try to develop or buy a conservation easement on that land after it got into the urban side of the line. They basically pay the difference in value between the development value and the agricultural value.
So if it's valued at $10,000 an acre for agriculture, it's valued at somewhere close to $1 million, they'll pay you
$990,000 theoretically. Now, finding somebody who will actually pay you $990,000 for that easement might be a trick.
Yeah, where are you going to get that kind of money?
But the appraisal is likely to show that kind of differential.
I mean, it doesn't pay for anything to keep it in the farming when it's that kind of value.
Right. Yeah, and generally the farm values are going to be pretty modest around here. As you say, they might be on the order of $10,000 an acre. And as you can see, a lot of the value depends on what we say that land can be used for, and that's the role of the zoning code and the relationship between the zoning code and the purchase of development rights program. Because if you have lax zoning that creates residential value on that land, then suddenly it drives the price way up. And in order to pull the development rights off of that property, you're going to pay an arm and a leg. So that's a great illustration. Yes?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding that in general, at least in Southern Oregon, that people are voluntarily doing this to their own property because they want to see it preserved in perpetuity. So this issue of incentive payments is not happening here unless there is some federal tax subsidies programs. Is that correct?
Yeah, so a lot of times what will happen, and even in circumstances like that where theoretically that value is worth $990,000, the landowner will do a bargain sale to a conservation organization or maybe a full-on donation. And so they're not going to see the whole value of that in that circumstance. Yes, sir?
Well, one circumstance we have here, it's probably not your case, but with the, are we close to completing the RPS process?
Thursday.
Okay. With that process, because it designates developable lands in the Bear Creek Valley here for the next 50 years, give or take, people who are outside that, theoretically by the way it's written, won't have an opportunity to get a rezone to urban use for another 50 years. So that kind of helps mitigate that issue of the problems with the double-edged sword of our land use laws, where on the one hand they help protect the quick grab farmland, they also in effect devalue. The differential is so huge. In this case, so those people who are out 50 years, they aren't going to see that kind of development potential value that you are if you're within an annexable area. So it would be much more attractive to them that $10,000 of, or the, whatever the development rights, yeah, do like $10,000, because they're looking at 50 years of hanging on their land before there is even a potential of realizing that higher urbanizing value. So,
there's going to be a lock on urban renewal development.
It's not a lock, no. the way the system, the
We
way,
can talk to you about that.
yeah, we'll talk about
Yeah.
it.
Continue.
Let's not go there. Thank you.
And, you know, just keep in mind that while that may be the theory of the way it's supposed to happen, 50 years is a geologic eon when it comes to zoning. Right? And you guys are probably the only ones in the county that are talking about 50-year periods for zoning. Because oftentimes there's a fair amount of churn on zoning policy. And every 5 or 10 years you see a significant difference in the thinking of elected bodies. So you really are kind of in an unusual circumstance here in Oregon. And I think most people would kill to be in your shoes from a farmland preservation standpoint, because you do have this underlying base of protection that most people would very much envy. So the benefits of conservation easements, I think these are pretty obvious, but permanently protect land from development. So it stabilizes the land base for agriculture, and of course this is a huge issue for farmland preservation around the country. And we continue to use or lose a tremendous amount of farmland. In the Puget Sound area, we've lost about 60% of our farmland, so almost 800,000 acres since 1950. So it's a big, big problem. We'll talk about this later on today. Allows farmers to convert equity in land into cash. This can be a really big deal. Farmers want to do improvements on their property or buy additional land. Oftentimes their only other alternatives is sell part of their operation or go to the commercial market for lending, and the ability to pull value off the land from the sale of an easement can really be a great factor. And keeps ownership and management of land in private hands, and generally on the tax rolls there is some latitude in this respect. So with regard to what's happening around the country in terms of state and local ag easement programs, there are 28 state-funded purchase of agricultural conservation easements or PACE programs, and they collectively protect about 2.2 million acres of farmland. So they're pretty effective around the country, and 91 locally funded PACE programs with about 400,000 acres protected. So, and some of the people in my organization have actually been around for a lot of this activity. So it's been a been a big period of fairly rapid growth in terms of conservation easements, and you can see here it looks over time from a 1980 to 2011 time frame, both in terms of the number of programs and the acreage protected. And, so this, as I mentioned before, is not a tool that's in wide use right now because of these issues of the valuation of land with and without the easement. But there does seem to be a lot of interest in trying to figure this out so that we can open up the use of conservation easements here in Oregon. Yes?
I was wondering, so the agricultural conservation easement usually protects land against development, housing development, but how about mining or other sort of resource extraction?
So you can, an easement is a very flexible tool, as I'm sure you're aware. You can pretty much write them to say whatever you want. I could take an easement on your property that would require that you paint your house pink for the rest of your life, and you and I could negotiate how much that would cost for you to have a pink house for the rest of your life. And so basically, if you feel like making sure that those uses don't occur, you can write that into your easement.
Have you heard of any similar programs to that, or?
I can't really answer that, but I'd be happy to put you in touch with people who could. So we have a lot of model easements that we've collected. A really great resource on this issue and a lot of other farmland preservation issues is the Farmland Information Center. It's a joint center operated by American Farmland Trust and USDA. If you just type Farmland Information Center on a Google search, you'll get right to it. And just there are pages after pages of resources, more than you could ever want to know about farmland protection. But and if you search for easements, you'll see all kinds of easement language in there. Sound good? So I'm not going to talk much about this one, transfer of development rights, because I know Catherine is going to deal with it at length. This is a tool that's been used around the country for perhaps around 30 years. There have been some really classic programs. Montgomery County, Maryland is often talked about as kind of the best case. It's an incentive-based system to encourage urban developers to buy development rights from farms in return for density bonuses. And so this is playing out right now up in the Puget Sound area around Seattle, and fueled largely because our development market's starting to revive, and we're starting to see sufficient demand within the urban areas to make density bonuses attractive to developers. So if you can develop 25 units instead of 20, it can be worth a fair amount. And it incentivizes this purchase of development rights from the rural landscape. And so ideally, it funds the removal of development rights without public funding. So we're very hopeful about this tool up at Puget Sound, because this strategy that we're trying to implement to protect a bunch of additional farmland, if we can implement a lot of that without public financing, that'd be fabulous. Let the development market pay for it. Kind of untested as yet. Tax relief for farmers. There was a presentation earlier today on your property tax relief program here in Oregon. It seems reasonably easy for properties within the EFU zones to get property tax relief. You do have to demonstrate income, not necessarily profitability, which is good. It seems like the entrance requirements are reasonable here. Getting the tax relief on the non-EFU side is a little bit difficult. We're running into some serious problems with our property tax relief programs up in Washington State, because we're actually asking assessors to make a determination about whether farms are actually being operated to generate a profit, and that's a hard call to make for the assessors. And the young woman who was here talking about that earlier today was very candid about some of the issues that they get into kind of making these difficult judgment calls. I think over time we're going to have to rethink a lot of this, about the income requirements particularly. The other thing I have qualms about with regard to property tax assessments is over time we might see a lot of farmland fall into a fallow state and then come back into active agricultural production. And it may be unrealistic to think that farms are going to get farmed every year. I mean, we're just going to see a fallow period in the rotational strategy. In some cases, it's going to be because the land transitions from one owner to the next. But we really need tools that don't drop people quite as suddenly as it sounds like this program might. So, sales tax, obviously not a huge issue in Oregon. In some states, they do allow sales tax relief on items related to agricultural production, including farm machinery, fuel, etc. So, federal income tax relief, and this is essentially for the donation or bargain sale of easements. There's some rules in place right now that will allow farmers to deduct 100% of the value of an ag conservation easement from their federal income tax. And this was slated to expire this year, but it's apparently going to get extended. So, and then there are a whole set of measures to promote local farm viability, and I'm actually going to talk about a lot of this stuff a little bit later today, so I don't think I'll really spend a lot of time going through this stuff. But when you think about what your local community is doing for farmland, and you think about, ag zoning and whether they're putting enough time into purchasing development rights and providing sufficient tax incentives, it's really important to also think about what they're doing and what they could be doing in terms of the economic viability of farming. Because there's an awful lot the local governments can do to actually help with the siting of farmers markets, encouraging buy local promotional programs, direct sales from farms to public institutions like hospitals and jails, and farm transition planning. So, as I say, I don't think I should run through these things to great extent today. So, let's see, this is a little bit on growth of farmers markets. I think we talked a little bit about that later, a little bit about the buy local stuff, blah, blah, blah. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And I think hold off on questions until later. Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, let's see. So if you escape, and let's see.
I got it.
You got it?
Oh. Yes.
Okay, great. All right. My name is Catherine Daniels, and I'm the Farm and Forest Land Specialist at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I am going to piggyback on top of what Dennis has shared with you by talking a little bit about what is actually happening here in Oregon, what kinds of tools and techniques we've got in effect right here, and also which additional tools and techniques we might think about using. The most successful farmland protection programs in the country use a variety of protection tools. They really do. They don't rely on one or two, but they actually use a variety because farmers and planners find themselves in a variety of different circumstances, and some tools just fit better under some circumstances than others. I want to just talk for a minute about just how important agriculture is to Oregon's economy. It's a huge player. It's the #2 industry in the state after the high-tech industry. Forestry's #3. So Oregon is still very dependent on its natural resource base in terms of a strong economy.
What did you say was number 3? I'm sorry.
Pardon?
What did you say was number 3?
3 is forestry. Still, even after the downturn in the forest industry, it's still #3. Considering the, okay, when I say #2, for farming, I mean farming and the spin-off industries connected to it, farm suppliers, farm processors, that kind of thing. Also considering the spin-off industries, Oregon agriculture provides 12% of the employment in the state, which is a pretty big figure. Oregon ranks 3 in exported products, contributing really significantly to the balance of trade for the state. And Oregon has a very diversified farm base. We grow more than 250 products. That is incredibly diverse when you consider there's some states that grow. You can count on, a hand or two what they grow. That helps insulate our farms from ups and downs in the economy. And finally, fully 95% of Oregon's farms are family farms. That's, sometimes you see big farms out there and you think they're corporate farms. Actually, 95% of them are owned by farmers. About 10% of that figure are actually also have a corporate structure, but are also family farms. So I think that we've got a very strong picture of agricultural production in the state. Every 20 minutes, another small farmer disappears. So we're all here because we support farming, we support farmland protection. But actually, the state of Oregon, the rate of farmland loss, farmland conversion to other uses in this state is a small fraction of what it is for other states when you look at the national picture. And that almost certainly is due to our strong farmland protection program. At the same time, in southern Oregon, we see a disproportionate amount of conversion down in this area here. Part of it's because southern Oregon doesn't have the same amount of high-value farmland. It has a higher degree of protection up in the valley. There's some other reasons for it too. But you do see a little bit of slicing and dicing down here, so there is some concern. And of course, the idea is we don't want to end up having the landscape look like this. So, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the agricultural protection toolbox. I'm just kind of adding to what Dennis has shared with you, and start by touching on the incentives list. Dennis mentioned use value assessment. We do have that in Oregon. All 50 states have that, where farmland is assessed at its lower actual farmland value. But in Oregon, we also have what we call a deferred farmland taxation. So when the time comes and you actually, if you develop your land, you actually have to pay back taxes, several years worth of back taxes. So that's a disincentive to develop. And that is considered a more protected kind of use value assessment. If your land is zoned for exclusive farm use, the tax assessment is automatic. You don't have to apply for it. If there's any kind of agriculture happening on your property at all, doesn't matter how much acreage you have or how much you earn from it, it's automatically assessed in a use value assessment if you're in an exclusive farm zone. If you're in any other kind of zone, you can apply for use value assessment. And the threshold is very low for it. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's something like 6 acres, $600 a year. You know, it's very minimal. So in Oregon, it really is. It's a great benefit, and it's pretty easy to get. Agricultural districts we don't use in Oregon. We really don't need to use them because our identifiers of areas within which benefits are allowed are our zones, our EFU zoning. So agricultural districts are more often used in states where there is no zoning, or there's poor zoning, poor farmland zoning, and those are areas within which lower tax rates are allowed and other financial benefits. Oregon has instead a set of right to farm law, as every other state does. Ours is in statute in Chapter 215, and it specifically forbids state and local and other agencies from enacting any local regulations that limit farm structures or normal farm practices. So that's an important protection for farmers. We also have something really unusual, I think, in Oregon. I don't know if it's used anywhere else, a waiver of remonstrance. Whenever a dwelling of any type is permitted in an exclusive farm use zone, the landowner must sign a statement that says that he will never take action against any adjacent farmer for any damages done, and that attaches to the deed, and it effectively becomes a kind of a deed restriction. And I'm not aware of other places that have that, but it's a really kind of a buyer beware notice to rural residential folks that they are in what we consider to be a working landscape. And they're really kind of guests in a working landscape, and they ought not think about complaining. Because residential development and farm use have often been at odds, have often conflicted with each other, created problems for each other, and so that is something that we have also in Chapter 215. Dennis described purchase, donation, and transfer of development rights. I'm going to spend a little more time on transfer of development rights in just a few moments. But I appreciate what you said about you considering farmland zoning in Oregon as being an important framework for the program. I've lived in other parts of the country, and I've seen purchase of development rights programs used to typically protect farm here, farm there, farm here, and not effectively protect a critical mass of farms in an area that's large enough to support farm infrastructure, supply businesses, the processing business, and things like that. And what's more, where you don't have the underlying zoning, let's say you've got 2-acre zoning or 5-acre zoning or something like that, what happens is that developers will find these farms and they will target them and they will develop right around them and sell those lots, telling people that you've got a forever view, that land will forever be undeveloped. And I've seen that happen too many times. And that is unfair to the farmers who have sold or donated their easements in good faith to then have public policy turn on them and effectively draw development to them. So I personally think PDR and TDR programs, PDR is the same as PACE, without underlying zoning are a waste, a misuse of public funds, actually. So, so what you have here is a couple of tax incentives for farmers. You have a couple of efforts to limit potential conflicts for farmers, and then you have some potential compensation for farmers. And altogether, these comprise some important incentives for farmers to hopefully keep them farming or attract them to farming. But in addition to incentives, there are regulations, and Oregon is one of the states that has determined that incentives don't do enough. And not everyone likes regulations, but sometimes they can be very effective, and we think they're very effective here in Oregon. So anyway, as you've heard, and you know, we do use exclusive farm use zoning in Oregon. We've got about 16 million acres. A little more than half of the private land base in Oregon is in exclusive farm use zoning. Very large amount. And it covers all we call class 1 through 4 land soils in western Oregon, class 1 through 6 soils in eastern Oregon out of 8 possible categories. So it's very inclusive. It's more inclusive than other parts of the country that might protect class 1 and 2 or 1 and 2 and 3 soils. One really nice thing is because we've picked up class 4 protection, sometimes even more land, that has allowed our winery industry to really build and grow and flourish, because those vineyards are normally on the kinds of soils that in other states would have been allowed to develop. They're not considered to be on farmland. So we had some foresight very early on, and now we're benefiting from it. So our EFU zoning has 3 aspects to it. First, it identifies and it allows a variety of farm uses, farm use, farm dwellings, farm worker housing, what we call family farm help dwelling is allowed. If a member of your household or a member of your family wants to have another house, a second house on the property, and need them to help you farm, you can do that. There's allowance for farm stands. It's a pretty liberal allowance. It allows the farm stand to sell not just farm products, but processed farm products like jams and ciders and things like that. Now there's some new allowance for a certain number of events, agritourism, things like that.
You're talking about the state, right? Because I don't think the county regulations are.
All the farm uses that are allowed in state statute, counties must allow as well.
What were you thinking they didn't allow?
We've been having trouble getting like farm stands and everything on EFU land unless they were grandfathered in.
Really?
No, I don't think that. I've talked to the county about it. It is a permitted use. You have to mostly sell your own products. You can't bring other products in.
Well, you can bring other products in. It has to be a combination.
Certain percentage, right?
But it's a
No, yours and, not percentage, but yours and other farms in the area.
in Jackson County, I think there's a percentage of what you. It has to be mostly your own.
There were several farmers there all struggling with this problem, so
Yeah,
Well,
I think
that's
there's some indication.
they might have.
Well, okay, raw farm products from your property and other farm products can be sold at your farm stand together with processed foods. So that would be usually just involving a couple of ingredients, you know, like jams or something like that, not prepared foods. Like, but 25% of your farm sales at the farm stand, that's the percent, can be other items other than raw food or processed foods. So if you wanted to sell knickknacks or sandwiches or something that is not raw or processed with 1 or 2 ingredients, and it falls into the 25%, you can have that at a farm stand. So, and I can give you my card if you like.
No, just to call the county again, because I did recently research this, and it seemed like there was a percentage of other farms products.
So in farm zones, okay, so the farm zones allow a variety of farm uses and farm-related uses, and for the most part, they're allowed outright, with the exception of some of the dwellings that have to be reviewed. And the counties are not allowed to add additional standards of their own to state standards. There's no discretion there. They have to use exactly the language that's in the statute.
And cities are also, because I know some of the cities are requiring it to be rezoned as commercial.
The cities can do what they like.
She's talking about just EFU.
Yeah,
Well, this is EFU within cities.
Well, but
No, there's no EFU.
But there's no protection in the state for agricultural lands within cities or within neighborhoods. So even if they call them, whatever they call themselves, there's no state protection for them. So it's up to the counties and the cities if they want to protect that. So in addition to the farm uses and farm-related uses that are, I didn't tell you some other uses also allowed, as they're pretty much an outright uses small processing facilities of crops, and as a conditional use commercial activities in conjunction with farm use. That could be a cannery, or also wineries are allowed as an outright use in farms. Then there are a variety of non-farm uses that are allowed in farm zones, that are either uses that require a rural location, like mineral and aggregate removal, or maybe a cell tower or something like that, not farm related, but they still need to be out there, or other uses that the legislature feels don't pose unnecessary conflicts for agriculture. So now between those two lists, there's a little over 50 uses allowed in farm zones, including 7 kinds of dwellings. But the dwellings are fairly restricted. Then in addition, there's a minimum lot size in every exclusive farm use zone. For most of the states, for most of the counties, it's 80 acres. In Eastern Oregon, it's 160 acres. And it is rather large, but there was a lot of research that went into establishing that minimum lot size. The idea was to have it be large enough to protect commercial agriculture. And by commercial agriculture, I don't mean corporate industrial agriculture. I mean a farm that makes $10,000 a year. So, but some counties, like down here in Southern Oregon, have what we call a go below. They have a few smaller minimum lot sizes, like 40 acres, 30 acres. Another tool, urban growth boundaries, we don't necessarily think of as a farmland protection tool, but it certainly is, because it identifies for cities 20 years worth of land that is needed to accommodate population growth. And the idea is that most of the growth within a given county will go into an urban growth boundary, a little bit will go into unincorporated communities, and only just a very little bit into exclusive farm zones and forests. Farmland mitigation is another program that I would call it a regulatory program that Dennis mentioned. A little bit different from purchase of development rights and transfer of development rights, because we're requiring the developer here to participate by either putting money into a kitty or a fund to buy development rights, or actually buying the development rights itself. So a little bit different from the TDR. But very intriguing. I'm very intrigued by that. I think it has a lot of potential in this state. So this is the idea behind transfer of development rights. Communities identify an area on a map that they would call a sending area, and that reflects some area that they feel is particularly important to protect. It could be farmland, forest land, habitat, or some combination of values. And then they identify another area that they think is appropriate for development. That's your receiving area. It's a village right there. An area with adequate infrastructure to accommodate somewhat higher density development than is currently allowed there. So an underzoned area, or an area newly added to an urban growth boundary or newly annexed, those are ideal receiving areas for development for TDR programs. So the owner of the sending area parcel sells the development rights. In exchange, puts a permanent conservation easement on the land. And the owner of the receiving parcel buys his development rights to build his so you effectively put like an overlay zone on the receiving area. Here's an example of, I don't know how well you can see it, of a map that shows you the sending and receiving areas for a town in New York. And the green area here is a farmland area that the community wants to protect. And these two green areas here are wellhead protection areas. So here's a community that wants to protect a couple different types of areas, and they want to direct their growth to 2 unincorporated communities. The basics of the TDR program, the essential ingredients of it, involved state enabling legislation, and Oregon in 2009 adopted enabling legislation. So now communities who are interested in this tool can adopt it. It involves amendments to the comp plan and zoning ordinance, So it can't be done just by land trusts and private citizens. It needs to have the planning department and the city or county are both involved in it as well. Involves conservation easements, sometimes intergovernmental agreements. If you have the development rights being transferred from a county to a city, for example, you need an intergovernmental agreement. And sometimes we call it TDR bank, which is a third party, so that if a farmer wants to sell development rights, doesn't necessarily have to search out the developer. He can just, in his own time frame, sell those rights to an intermediary, for example, a county or possibly a land trust, and they hold on to those rights and they can sell them to a developer. For a developer, that's also one-stop shopping. Instead of hitting up 6 different farms, the developer can go straight to that bank and buy up all the development rights they want or they need. These are some of the most successful TDR programs across the country. King County, Washington is actually, those are two TDR transactions for forest land protection. Quite large. Dennis mentioned Montgomery County. There's some others there as well. TDR programs are somewhat complex to develop, and people tend to shy away from them, but they just need to be very carefully constructed to be effective, and have been effective in some other places. Dennis mentioned Montgomery County. I'm not going to go through the whole key here, but suffice it to say that all the various shades of green are lands that are permanently protected, either through a purchase of development rights program, transfer development rights program, or some other type of program. That's a big chunk of the county. And naturally, people who want to create a PDR or TDR program need to prioritize lands for protection. You can't think that you're going to protect the whole, all the EFU land or all the forest land, because there's never going to be enough money to do it, and not necessarily enough interested people. Here's a town in Pennsylvania that again shows you that they're using a combination of TDR, PDR, actually a couple different PDR programs with underlying zoning. So that this is a borough, which is like a city, and outside it is all the green and brown areas are preserved, and the white areas white areas have zoning, underlying zoning that's protected as well. There's only one example in Oregon of TDR, and it's in LaPine, Deschutes County, and it's not a farmland protection program, it's protection of groundwater. And I'm hard to understand the map. But it has been pretty successful. It's a county-owned receiving area. The county bought the land cheaply, I think from the BLM, and so they have a receiving area, and they require the development rights to be transferred into that receiving area. And the idea is to get people not to be building houses with septic systems that are going to further contaminate the aquifer. It's a really creative use of TDR. So here's the bill that was passed a couple of years ago, allowing intermunicipal programs. The receiving areas do have to be either in an urban growth boundary or an urban reserve, but there are open-ended incentives available for landowners and developers. And that's important because, as we've discussed here earlier, there are relatively few development rights that attach to farmland in the state. It's an exclusive farm use zoning. So, but what counties could do if they were interested in developing a program like this is to assign to farmland in the EFU zones a greater number of development rights that are transferable than they otherwise would be allowed to exercise on site. So if a given 8-acre property has one development right, let's say, one dwelling that can develop, it could be assigned 2 or 3 development rights instead. You can develop one dwelling on that property, or you can transfer 2 or 3 if you're willing to sell them to be used off-site. That could be a really meaningful incentive for someone, and very low cost for communities. In this day and age, we don't have a lot of money for purchase of development rights programs. It's unlikely to get the kind of money that other programs like this across the country we have in the past. I think very unlikely. So to be able to use something like transfer development rights or farmland mitigation is I think the way to go and the way to look at things. So, just in summary, TDR adds another tool to the toolbox. Economical and market-based, provides income for farmers, protects farmland, can be used strategically. This one I think is important. I've seen TDR used to, at the edge of urban growth boundaries, or the edge of cities, for example, to block the path of growth in the direction of the most productive farmland. You always have to consider that not every parcel is going to end up under easement, so how can you use those easements most strategically? Of course, when they're donated to a land trust, then you don't have a lot of ability to be strategic. But to the extent that land trusts or counties or others can purchase easements, it really makes sense to be very strategic. Either lining them up at the edge of development with easements that prohibit crossing them with sewer and water lines, so that development doesn't move far over those parcels, or use them strategically to help build up a critical mass, a large area of farmland that would be protected. I was just today driving down, kind of comparing farmland mitigation and TDR in my mind and thinking which one I like better. They each have advantages. Really, TDR is purely, it involves a county, and then the county has to set it up. But then it's market-based, so that has an attraction, a political attraction, because it's less controversial. Both the sending area landowner and the developer in the receiving area can participate on a purely voluntary basis. There's nothing mandatory about it, so that's attractive. But it's kind of unpredictable who's going to use it, which parcels are going to get protected. The advantage of the farmland mitigation program is it's more predictable and more effective, especially if you have a pot of money, the option of a pot the developers contribute to, then the county can buy up those easements exactly where it wants them to be. That's powerful, but undoubtedly controversial among the building community, because they're going to be asked to pay essentially tax. But that kind of program has withstood legal challenges very well over the years. It's been those kinds of exactions have stood up in court for parkland dedication and road improvements and things like that across the country. So I'm happy to talk to any counties or any land trusts or anybody else who's interested in kind of feeling out some of these options and seeing if they're right for the community. I know that Jackson County, as Greg said, has considered farmland mitigation in the past and kind of set it to one side. But if folks are interested in revisiting it, happy to do that. Just give me a call. Thanks. Any questions for Dennis or me? Yeah.
Can you talk about the incentives again under the Senate bill? Is it the proposed Senate bill?
No, it's adopted.
It's adopted. What are the incentives?
Incentives? Okay. Well, it's an enabling piece of legislation. It would require a county to adopt its own specific standards, but it sets broad, it creates a broad framework. So the incentives that they would allow the sending area landowner to be are not described. They're left to the county, really. The counties are not going to assign, a 20-to-1, transfer standard, because then they're not going to be able to find another municipality that's going to be willing to accept that level of density in their receiving area, so there's going to be kind of a natural balance to it. But the only...
That's the idea, is you get more units.
Yeah.
I know in Tahoe Basin, for instance, it's like 3 to 1. For every 1 unit you retire in a stream fire wetland, you get 3
Well, exactly. So that's the primary incentive that's certainly available for the sending area landowner. For the developer, the incentive would be that they get to develop at a higher density than they otherwise would be able to. Let's say the density is 4 units per acre, and if they buy a development right, they get to develop at 6 units per acre. So, but the other challenge in Oregon is that a lot of our cities already have fairly high zoning densities. So that's why I say this TDR isn't going to fit everywhere. It best fits a community that's expanding its UGB, or just annexing land that's not already zoned for higher density, or maybe putting in new sewer and water lines that are going to allow it to increase the density. So instead of just giving the density away, it's essentially getting something in exchange for it. And the incentive for the receiving area community, sometimes the receiving areas don't, they say, why should we take that added density, But if you can have the sending area, the protected area, fairly close into the receiving area, for example, if I was in a city and I knew that there was going to be permanently preserved land on the edge of my city, I might be willing to take a little more density in my neighborhood. If I knew that there was going to be no more development ever fairly close to me.
Yeah, the old mantra, with density and hate.
So.
Yeah, maybe I can just speak to TDR for a little bit, because it's an idea that's been kicking around for 20 or 30 years in planning circles, and there's still relatively few really successful TDR programs, and those that are successful manage to navigate a couple of key constraints. Typically, the biggest constraining factor is the receiving zone planning and development standards. And what it requires in order to work is that you have to have local political leadership that is first willing to cap densities, because, as you just mentioned, many of them are more inclined to just give density away. If the development community says that they want to develop at 25 units instead of 20, a lot of local governments are pretty reflexive about allowing them to do so. And particularly in this day and age, when everybody wants to see more economic development in their cities, there's going to be a tremendous trend to give densities away. So you need to have the political appetite to cap the density and then to relieve the cap by buying development rights from the sending areas. So kind of complicated politically, and that traditionally has been the big constraint in getting these programs up and running.